Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the previous lectures, we've talked about the Tet Offensive, the massive attacks early in 1968. And in this lecture, the last in this series, we'll talk about the fallout from the Tet Offensive and ultimately the demise of the Lyndon Johnson administration on the home front. As mentioned in the previous lectures, the Tet Offensive militarily was a big defeat for the North and Viet Cong forces. And there was the thought that a final major push at that point might have led to ultimate military victory for the Americans. Some of Lyndon Johnson's advisors urged him to widen the war at that point. The Joint Chiefs wanted to escalate the bombing campaign in the North. But Lyndon Johnson had wider issues. The Cold War seemed to be heating up in other areas of the world. Korea, Berlin, and the Middle East all were points of contention in early 1968. 1968, as it turned out, was one of the major flashpoint years in all of world history. There were cataclysmic events going on all over the globe. American forces were stretched to the limit. Expanding the war in Vietnam yet again would require dramatic increases in the war effort, and further increases to maintain U.S. reserves and forces elsewhere. This was a critical time in the course of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. In February 1968, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Army General Earl Wheeler, encouraged General Westmoreland to request more troops for Vietnam, partly to shore up American troop strength around the rest of the world. Westmoreland agreed, requesting 206,000 additional troops, even as the siege at Khe Sanh was coming to an end. The troop request was delivered to Lyndon Johnson on February 28, 1968. To make the request seem more urgent and to shore up needs elsewhere, Wheeler downplayed the successes of Tet and painted a negative picture of the situation. He hoped to pressure Lyndon Johnson into providing the troops, but ultimately it backfired. The negative assessment opened up a debate in the Johnson administration that ultimately turned the direction of the war. Even some of the old reliable hawks of the Johnson administration began to balk at this point. Robert McNamara urged against sending more troops, instead improving recruitment for ARVN troops and letting them fight the war. Johnson was in a tough spot. He couldn't send such a large number of troops without activating the reserves and increasing the draft, and probably having to approach Congress for permission, and perhaps even a declaration of war. At the same time, he didn't want to alert anyone that he had reached his limits in willingness to wage the war, especially if the troop requests became public, as they eventually did. Johnson asked his new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, to put together a study group of the troop request. Clark Clifford was a longtime stalwart in the Democratic Party. He had been Truman's campaign manager in 1948, when Truman won his dramatic victory over Dewey. He had been an advisor to Kennedy and an informal advisor to LBJ prior to being appointed Secretary of Defense to replace McNamara. Clifford had already begun to doubt the direction of the war. He was uncertain that the domino theory was a valid reason for continuing to fight the war. In September 1967, in traveling to Asia, he discussed the idea with leaders in Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, and elsewhere, and found none of them concerned that defeat in Vietnam would lead to revolution in their nations. Clifford discussed the troop request with many influential people, governors and local officials, businessmen and lawyers. All were concerned with further escalation of the war. Clifford eventually formed a task force, including several of the senior advisors to the president. This included Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, General Wheeler, and others. This task force raised fundamental questions about the direction of the war. and went beyond just asking about the immediate troop request. They asked things like, will the additional troops win the war? If not, how many more? There was no answer. Would the enemy respond with more troops? Probably. How much would it cost? Maybe $2 billion a month? What about increased bombing? It didn't seem likely to change the outcome. Clifford was astonished at the failure of American strategy, and here's what he said. I could not find out when the war was going to end. I could not find out the manner in which it was going to end. I could not find out whether the new requests for men and equipment were going to be enough, or whether it would take more, and if more, how much. I could not find out how soon the South Vietnamese forces would be ready to take over. All I had was the statement, given with too little self-assurance to be comforting, that if we persisted for an indeterminate length of time, the enemy would choose not to go on. And so I asked, does anyone see the diminution in the will of the enemy after 4 years of our having been there, after enormous casualties, and after massive destruction from our bombing? The answer was that there appeared to be no diminution in the will of the enemy. Clifford's task force concluded that the United States should not agree to the troop request, and additionally should, quote, level off our involvement and work toward gradual disengagement. Clifford delivered his report to Lyndon Johnson on March 4th. The president contemplated the report for several days. Others were encouraging him to escalate the war and strike harder. In the middle of his contemplation, on March 10th, 2 New York Times reporters, Hedrick Smith and Neil Sheehan, broke the story that Lyndon Johnson was considering sending an additional 206,000 troops. The White House denied the story, but it quickly became impossible for Johnson to send the troops even if he had wanted to. Public outrage and confusion was obvious. If we've just won this great victory, how could we possibly need another 200,000 troops? Even traditional hawks in Congress seemed to be backing away from the further commitment. The Tet Offensive had elevated the war once again to a major political issue, one that had to be discussed and debated. And with 1968 an election year, it became the single most important issue. Lyndon Johnson was up for re-election in 1968. Prior to Tet, his position as the Democratic nominee had been little in doubt. Public opinion was still on his side, and he still had the support of his party. But in the New Hampshire primary on March 12th, Lyndon Johnson found that he barely eked out a victory over a little-known senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy had no money, no organization, and only one platform. He was opposed to the war. In the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy came within 500 votes of beating Johnson. It was clear, not that McCarthy was a bona fide candidate, but that the public was ready to vote for someone other than Lyndon Johnson. 4 days later, a much more significant candidate joined the mix, New York Senator Robert Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson knew that the presidential race would be long and difficult after that. At the same time, public opinion polls showed Johnson at his lowest approval ratings yet. On top of all this, there were disturbing reports about the economy. The dollar was declining. War spending was leading to inflation. There was concern that sending additional troops might send the economy into a tailspin, as it seemed certain such a commitment would require additional expenses and probably taxes. On March 17th and 18th, Johnson gave speeches attacking his critics and defending his war policies. The speeches were not well received, and his poll numbers did not improve. Meantime, his advisers and the wise men urged him to deny the troop increase and try to scale back the war effort. On March 24th, not yet publicly, Lyndon Johnson approved a troop increase of only 13,500. This would be the last increase of American military manpower committed to the war. At the same time, recruitment efforts for the ARVN increased, as they announced they would be adding 135,000 more troops. Also, Lyndon Johnson recalled General Westmoreland. While some felt he was dismissed or this was an insult, actually Johnson had approved of his leadership and considered his new appointment as the Army Chief of Staff in Washington a promotion. The new MACV commander was General Creighton W. Abrams, Westmoreland's deputy. But on another hand, recalling Westmoreland sent the message that the man who has continually requested more troops is gone. Someone else has been put in charge. There would be no more escalation. On March 26, Lyndon Johnson had a lengthy lunch meeting with many of his advisors and the wise men. The same men who had guided him down a road of escalation now abandoned him. They all urged him to pursue a policy of de-escalation and trying to get out. As Johnson said after the meeting, the establishment bastards have bailed out. For the next few days, Johnson worked on a major speech to be delivered on March 31st. It would become one of the true bombshell speeches in presidential history. On Sunday evening, March 31st, Johnson appeared on television from the Oval Office. He appeared weary, as he was. The speech included 4 major announcements. 1. It repeated the offer of peace negotiations to North Vietnam, as well as a temporary stoppage in the bombings for North Vietnam to consider. 2. It announced only 13,500 troops would be sent, rejecting the request for more. 3. That the United States effort in Vietnam from that point on would be focused on improving the military capabilities of South Vietnam's armed forces. And 4th, and most famously, the speech included the following statement: I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Johnson's announcement was stunning, but he had considered it for some time. He was concerned about his health and worried he wouldn't live out a second term. With McCarthy's success and Kennedy's candidacy, he knew that the campaign would be grueling, and he truly didn't have the energy for it. He also knew an even more difficult campaign lay ahead with Richard Nixon, the likely Republican candidate. 3 days later, Hanoi indicated its readiness for peace talks, which were scheduled for May 13th. On April 14th, the Pentagon officially denied Westmoreland's troop request and announced the ceiling of 549,500 on U.S. troop deployment in South Vietnam. It felt for all the world like American involvement in Vietnam might be coming to an end.